Welcome to the Underground, the Steel City Underground, the black and gold standard for Pittsburgh Steelers coverage. Now, here are your hosts, Brian E. Roach and Zach Metkler.
Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of the Steel City Underground podcast. A little late this week, but better late than never. Waiting for more news to break, things to change, drama to erupt, so that we could tell you we're sponsored this week by who knew who, Ronald Ocean again maybe. Either way, my name is Brian Roach. I am here forever how long I can continue to talk because I'm very tired. And to help me out, joining us for this episode, the professor of football, Zachariah Metkler. Zach, welcome aboard again.
Thanks for having me back on here, Brian.
So before we get rolling, we're going to do an opening, but the opening will be topical because Joe and I have gotten some grief about our openings not being topical, but we're going to jump right into football here. One of the big things that happened this week is Mike Munchak took a position, not an advancing position, as the offensive line coach of the Denver Broncos, and that has stirred up the nation, rightly so, because Munchak is a well-beloved coach. He's done a fantastic job taking an offensive line that was getting Ben Roethlisberger sacked at a extensively high rate and turned it into potentially the best line in the league. But there's been, of course, a lot of drama again. Yeah, drama, more drama surrounding this. People talking about how the Steelers let Mike Munchak go, or they let him slip away, or they didn't sign him back up quick enough because his contract had expired. And I think what we all need to remember is that there are things that sometimes impact coaches and players more so than contracts, than money, than anything else. And Munchak has even come out and said this. But the big thing about Denver, and one of the reasons he even applied as or interviewed as a head coach there, was he has family there. And I think that's the bottom line on this change. What do you think?
Yeah, I think the whole narrative that it's the Steelers not doing their due diligence to keep one of their, if not their best coach, I think that's a lazy excuse just to continue to try to beat the dead horse about how disappointing this season was. He had the opportunity to leave last year for other head coaching gigs. He turned them down because he wanted to stay in Pittsburgh. He's done nothing but talk highly of the organization, highly of the city. And you kind of have to think that the only way he was going to leave is if, Denver really kind of came forward with an offer of one way or the other. I think he wouldn't have stepped down to a lesser position. Not saying some position coaches have more say than others, but O-line is a relatively high-ranking position coach within a lot of organizations, especially on offense. You have to think that the family played a big part of that. And I think that whether fans want to admit it or not, just like any job, whenever you're looking to relocate, have a chance for promotion in another city or something like that, family typically is one of the things that was always at the forefront of those conversations. Just because these guys are NFL coaches, it's still a job. It's still something they have to consider with family. And if that was that much of an appealing factor to him to leave whenever his contract happened to be up in Pittsburgh, I don't blame him at all for taking it. There's no ill will. And the guy is a sought-after coach. I mean, he's a very well-known coach in the league, and he's going to have offers. If he didn't get offered this year, he'd get offers next year and next year. And I guarantee you, even next year in Denver, there will be teams that will come in and want to talk to him, and he'll probably just deny it because he'll be happy with being by his family. And the sooner that Steelers fans kind of accept that, the quicker they can move on with his replacement, which we all know now.
Yeah, and the other piece of that puzzle is, I mean, even Munchak's come out and said he loves Pittsburgh, he likes playing here. He probably wouldn't have left for anybody but Denver, and it's because of family. It's not because of anything that's going on here. And I know people are going to provide lip service to that. But the Steelers were pretty quick in announcing who was going to take over for him, was his assistant. And I know we looked this up because I wasn't sure how to pronounce his name, and guess what? I've said this repeatedly on the show. I'm terrible at names, and I've already forgotten. So you introduce him.
Sean Surratt. Yeah, it looks like Surratt. I'm glad I looked it up because I always thought it was Surratt for as long as he's been on the staff. It's Sean Surratt.
Yeah, and I mean, he's worked, 5 years with Munchak?
He's worked 5 years with Munchak. He's been with the team for 7, so he's not a new face in the Steelers. And quite frankly, there's not a better guy to learn from. And I think a lot of things people don't realize with position coaches like that, especially when you have 2 of them. The second guy, even though his title is assistant offensive line coach, he's doing a lot of coaching with that. A lot of times you'll see guys go and they'll divide up the lines. They'll have right side, left side, or they'll have interior offensive line and tackles, tight ends. Having a guy like Surratt in there, this isn't his first rodeo. I mean, he's been an offensive line coach before. He played offensive line. He's had 5 years to pick at Munchak's brain and build a relationship with these guys. I think this is about as seamless of a transition as you can get. Obviously, Munchak is consistently considered to be the best, if not one of the best offensive line coaches in the NFL. So Surratt has massive shoes to fill, but I'm glad that they decided to go with that route rather than try to bring in a guy from the outside.
Absolutely. I mean, it provides consistency. These guys have been doing their job, and I think that's great. And so I guess the bottom line is, let's slow our roll on the talk about how the Steelers are letting him get away. Joe wrote a really nice article on the website about losing Mike Munchak. They didn't lose him. They didn't not do their due diligence. But, look, what's better or worse, letting a guy go to where his family wants him to go, or trying to keep a guy who now has maybe soured a little bit because you didn't let him do what his heart wanted him to do? You can't force these guys to stay in a position, if that's not where they want to be. We talked about it a little bit offline, and I'm not going to use the terminology that I used at that point, but, freedom is a real thing, and choice of where you work is also a real thing. So let's slow the roll of the Steelers blew this, because I don't think the Steelers blew anything here. It just is one of the unfortunate things that happens when you're really good at what you do. People are going to offer you, and when you have a chance to go play or coach where your family is, and make it a much more tolerable process, then why wouldn't you? But as I mentioned in the brief opening, the primary focus of this podcast is not going to be Munchak. It's not going to be Sean Surratt. Did I say it right? Woohoo! Yay for me. It's going to be one Ronald Ocean again, Antonio Brown. I'm going to kind of our agenda here was originally to determine what Antonio Brown's value may or may not be, because there's been a lot of speculation out there. There's a lot of prominent beat writers and national writers indicating what they think the Steelers might get for him. I know what I think, and Zach certainly knows what he thinks. But I want to start off with, what world is Antonio Brown living in?
It's this one.
Because I'm looking at the tweets that are coming out from Antonio Brown, and I think that he's really using a random word generator and just saying, let's pick words. You know the trick that they do this on Facebook posts sometimes, and they'll do it with other things. They'll say, just go into your auto spell or your autocomplete and pick the first 9 words and see what it says. I think that's what he's doing in his tweets. He's just going in there, blah, 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 blah. And because the stuff he's saying is bizarre in the sense, it's not like bizarre you're going, oh, wow, he said chickens will rule the world. It just doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, no, he's almost coming off as like a man unhinged, and it reminds me almost a lot like Kanye West, who's become Twitter famous over the years for a lot of the wrong reasons. Other than the fact Kanye West is already famous, but that just brings more attention to him. You have a guy of AB's magnitude in the sports world. I don't know if it's cryptic. I don't know if he knows what he's saying. I have no idea. I mean, I consider myself to be a relatively educated person. I have no idea. I can't make any sense of it, where he's coming from. And, you see some of these guys retweeting him. I think they're retweeting it more just from the sake of they're trying to figure out themselves, because I don't know if anyone really has any idea at this point.
Just as an example, here you go. I am definitely keeping analysis busy while creating jobs for the future analysts. How's business? AB always booming. Interview coming soon for everybody. I am definitely keeping analysis busy. while creating jobs for the future analysts. Huh?
I mean, maybe he's trying to say that, what we're doing right now, we're having a conversation about what he's saying, and he's keeping us busy to sit there and say, well, did you see what AB said? I don't know. I have no idea. I don't know where it's coming from. I don't know. Maybe he's playing the whole game. Maybe he's doing some type of social experiment or something like that. And he's actually, above all of us when it comes to this entire concept. I have no idea.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, he's removed all things Steelers from his profiles on social media. He's tweeted a lot of things. He's been teasing everybody with the idea that he's going to come out with an interview soon to talk about things. He's been online with James Harrison. He's been online with Chad Ochocinco, smoking cigars. It's not the best look, and I don't know what it all boils down to. But the bottom line is, I think the more this goes on, the less likely that there's any path to reconciliation available to them. And a lot of, Juju came out and said he wants Antonio Brown to stay. Ben has come out and said, I want Antonio Brown to stay. But, at the same time, Art Rooney II came out and said, I can't envision a way that he's still here, even though he followed that up with, we aren't closing any doors. I'm going to probably continue to ask this every week that we have to keep talking about this. But as we sit here right now, give me your thoughts, your percentage thoughts. Is it possible that AB is still here next year? And what's your percentage?
I mean, is it possible? Yeah, but every week or every day that this continues to go on and be a news story, my percentage that he's here continues to decrease. I mean, originally, I know we discussed the AB situation 2 weeks ago back now, after week 17. I was with you on probably about a 75% chance he'd be back, and now I don't even know if those are 50%. I think the fact that he seems to be continuing to distance himself from the franchise by taking the things out. I know it's something trivial as removing something from your bio, unfollowing the team, which, whatever. I don't read into that as much as others do. I think it's telling of his frustration. But at some point in time, I'd love to see them, all be adults, sit down at AB and the organization, iron things out. I just think the more this goes on and the more he continues to distance himself, and when there's no, as far as I'm concerned, the ball's in his court. If the reports are true that, ownership and Tomlin and Colbert all reached out to him to try to contact him, and he chose to, ignore the calls or not respond. As far as I'm concerned, at this point in time, the ball's in his court for whenever he wants to go and do that. And by doing these things with James Harrison, Chad Ochocinco, apparently talking to Jerry Rice about places he'd like to play, and not talking to the organization itself, the people who he's currently employed for, I'd give it probably about anywhere between a 35 and 40% chance he's back in Pittsburgh at this point in time. And by the time, end of January rolls around, I might be down to like a 25% chance. Every day that this keeps going on, I just have this feeling that it's not going to happen. I honestly, at this point in time, I know there's been people talking about it on Twitter. I'm more convinced that we're going to see Le'Veon Bell back in Pittsburgh next year more than we are Antonio Brown. That's where I'm at with him. I'm still 50-50 on whether or not I'd want him back, just due to the whole locker room aspect of it. But I think the writing is starting to be on the wall more and more and more. And I think it's coming to a point where the damage is going to be to the point where you either A, it's not able to be fixed, or B, you don't want to fix it at all.
Yeah, that's where I'm at the point where I don't really care if it gets fixed. I don't view this as, I tweeted this out, and I may have said it before on the podcast. People don't change unless they want to change, and the only thing that forces people to change is a repercussion for the action that they've done, or a deep-seated need to an understanding of themselves to change things. I don't see that ever happening with Antonio Brown. I don't care how much discipline the Steelers or Tomlin might attempt to put on him, and I know that there's been a lot of criticism about discipline, and there are people who are actually blaming Mike Tomlin for Antonio Brown becoming this, diva nightmare receiver. But diva night rim receivers are everywhere. That's, the more self-focused that they become, and as they have success, it just breeds this kind of a personality. I just don't see him changing. I don't see him becoming, something else. I think this is probably from stories that have been being reported, from different people who are saying things that actually know or have had experience with Antonio Brown, because there's a lot of high-profile NFL, ex-NFL players and on-screen talent who want to come out and say, "Oh, AB is great and it's awesome and it's all Ben's fault or it's all this person's fault." Look, there's plenty of blame to go around in this, but these are people who have never played with and don't have firsthand experience with Antonio Brown. They have lip service experience with Antonio Brown. The people who have come out and said things that have had firsthand knowledge and firsthand experience kind of been falling on the other side of the track there. I'm not seeing a lot of ex-teammates that have come out and said, "Oh, that's not AB. AB's not any of these things. You're crazy." Emmanuel Sanders threw him under the bus.
I mean, what else more you'd want?
I mean, he just said, "Dude, you're wrong. This is all on AB, period. Yes, Ben is not the greatest leader, and maybe Ben isn't the greatest leader." Look, people decide to lead in different ways. Ben might think the right way to lead is to call out teammates, and teammates need to then say what Emmanuel Sanders said he would have said, which is keep my name out of your mouth if you don't like that. But at the same time, it's worked pretty well for Ben. I don't necessarily 100% agree with it, and some people are going to react to it differently. But to say that is why AB is acting out the way he's acting out is ridiculous. Okay, so if we then take the next step in this intellectual journey that we're on here, and we assume that the high percentage likelihood is that Antonio Brown is no longer welcome on the south side in the Steelers facilities, then where does he go? And what are the Steelers going to do with him? Art Rooney II has flat out said they're not going to release him. And of course they're not going to release him. That's just absurd. They've got him under contract for another 3 years. There is value there, and a lot of value. Because despite everything we've just said, Antonio Brown is in fantastic shape. He is a top 3, if not top 2 receiver still in this league. He is a draw. He is, gifted at his craft. All of those things are true, and somebody out there will want him on their team. Multiple somebodies out there will want him on this team. So I've heard people say, "Oh, the best they can hope for is a second rounder." I've heard people say, "Oh no, you can get a top 10 pick." That's very, very unlikely in my view. And a lot of people have said you can get a first rounder. We touched on this the last time around, thinking, we talked about, I know, the Raiders and a couple other potential trade partners because they might have capital. But we've both been, I know, looking at what might and might not be realistic, and at the same time examining this draft class, because I think the preconceived notion by I shouldn't say every, that's too strict. By most people is we need something for this draft class. We need a draft pick in this draft class. I'm going to go out on a limb and say I don't want a draft pick in 2019 for Antonio Brown. I will happily take 2020 picks all day and every day for Antonio Brown. If you want to add in a 2019 pick, okie dokie. But I don't care if I get first-round picks in 2019. I'd rather have capital in 2020 because I think this is a weak draft class, and the next draft class projects better. What say you, oh professor of football?
Yeah, I mean, I have a tendency to agree with that. It's not that there aren't playmakers in this 2019 class, and it's not that there's guys that I wouldn't want to have on the Steelers, or if I'm a GM, wouldn't want to have on my team. There's definitely going to be guys here. Every class has guys that come out and surprise. I just think when you look at the projected classes for 2020, it projects to be a much heavier class when it comes to the big winners, especially at quarterback, which I'll get to here in a second, could really impact the Steelers in a positive manner for getting picks in 2020. Now, I get that people are going to want to have picks in 2019 because of the fact that, we're in win now mode. Ben's window's closing. You have a core team that's a lot of them are still in their rookie contracts. You want to get the championship now, so let's get the pick now. But if that pick's not going to be able to contribute, then what's the point in getting the pick now? I think the only real way the Steelers are going to be able to get a top 10 pick this year, as far as I'm concerned, and this Colbert has surprised us in the past, and teams are always more desperate than they might let on to begin with. I think realistically, the only way they're going to get a top 10 or top 5 of that matter pick is if they're willing to swap first round picks, where the Steelers would give up their 20th overall pick for, say, a guy who has, the 7th or through 10th pick, and packaged AB with it. That's really the only conceivable way I do it. I know a lot of people look at the Amari Cooper trade with the Cowboys as a means as to why AB has this out of this world value. Don't get me wrong, career trajectory wise, I don't believe that Amari Cooper will ever be able to touch what AB has done in his career. Is he an impressive receiver? Yes. Is he having a career resurgence with the Cowboys after what we saw in the second half of the season? Yes. But his market price of a first-round draft pick is because he's a guy on a rookie contract. He's a young receiver, and he has loads and loads of potential, especially for a team unbelievably desperate to find a number one target that they haven't had since Des Bryant departed. And I think that plays a big part. Now, AB is still playing at an extremely high level. He's still playing at all-pro level. He's still playing and hopefully can continue playing into his 30s, much like we saw Jerry Rice do with the 49ers and other teams in the NFL. So I think realistically, I would believe that a team would be willing to give up decent draft capital. I just don't envision a team who typically, if you're picking in the top 10, you're not in win now mode. And I think a team that's going to want to go after AB is a team that's going to be in win now mode, which typically, like I said, is not a team in the top 10. And if they are a team in the top 10 that feel like they're close, which I know there's about 2 teams we're going to mention here shortly that are kind of close in the win now mode if it wasn't for injuries. But realistically, a guy like AB who's going to be 31 next season, still in the top of his game, under contract for 3 more years, I understand that. If I'm a GM, I'm not willing to give up that type of draft capital at the very top of the draft class for a guy like AB who, yes, he has the talent. Yeah, you might be able to control him. He might have an awakening where he realizes he needs to get his attitude together. I just am not willing to give up that capital, especially with how talented the top 10 of this year's class is on the defensive side of the ball. For the Pittsburgh Steelers, it'd be fantastic if they can get one of those picks because there's about 7 guys that are going to the top of this year's class that are defensive playmakers that will be able to come in day one and make an impact for Pittsburgh. I just don't envision the teams be willing to give up that, which brings me to why, for what you said, going with the 2020 pick, there are a lot of quarterbacks in this upcoming class in 2020 that are going to have high first-round projection or low first-round projections that similar to what we saw in 2018 with the likes of Rosen, Darnold, Mayfield, guys of that nature, Josh Allen. And whenever you see quarterbacks with that type of talent going early in the class, that just drives down the value of other guys who might be better players, but we've seen teams do stupid stuff for quarterbacks that they think are going to save and change their franchise. And because of that, that drives down value of other that could be positions of need that will start falling, not because they're not talented, but simply because teams are flying up to grab the next, great quarterback for their franchise. Because of that, in a class that I think is going to have more talent overall at various positions, at least at this point, that impressed me more than the 2019 class. I would be okay with going and trading, say, like a 3rd-round pick or a 2nd-round pick in 2019 and trying to net a 1st-round pick in 2020, mainly because of the fact that the talent, I think, is better. It's going to be there. And I understand there's the whole window argument, and I understand that. And I don't disagree with that, where you want to get the picks now, gives you an extra year to develop them, and it gives you more of a chance for them to make an impact, like a TJ Watt type impact in year 1 where they can come in and help out. I just think when you're looking purely at the value, getting future picks in 2020 will be beneficial. In the event that Ben, would end up riding off in the sunset prematurely, then you have more pieces at that point then to try to rebuild. So I think it kind of plays, both sides. And the Steelers, I think, are going to be more aggressive in free agency this year, which will help offset the loss of AB if they move on from him. I think there's a lot of benefits to looking, like you said, into 2020, not completely not acknowledging 2019 because they'd be foolish to get rid of AB and then have no compensation this year. I just think getting a high or a low first round pick is going to be a little bit too much to ask. I know a lot of people don't want to hear that because everyone thinks that, the whole Amari Cooper argument. I don't envision that happening because I think the baggage is going to play out in GM's minds more than people would let on to. And I also don't think teams are going to want to give up prime draft stock for a class that doesn't have any truly elite quarterback prospects, regardless of how you feel with guys like Kyler Murray and Dwayne Haskins. So I agree with you. I think it'd be beneficial to look to the future while still trying to net something in the mid rounds this year. I think there actually is some decent talent. I'm not saying the 19 class is terrible. There is some talent there. I just don't know how deep those positions are at areas of need that the Steelers are trying to look forward to in 2019.
Yeah, the way I look at this is the Steelers own the 20th pick in the draft. And I guess they have the 20th in the second round. If they could net something along the lines of a high second round pick this year, or even a mid-round or mid-level second-round pick this year, and a first-round pick next year for AB, I can see a team being willing to do that. And look, in my mind, AB is absolutely worth a first-round pick. He may be worth multiple first-round picks, because I think he has enough juice left in the tank that he's going to be a top-end, impactful player for whoever he plays for several years. I also think he's going to be a mess and cause culture problems and be a pain in the butt at some point. I think he'll behave for the first year because he's going to want to prove that he's not whatever. But I think ultimately you don't change and things will just end up being the same way they are now. But that being said, we talked about this, and I know we looked at teams that we thought might fit, because the other option is they could conceivably get a mid to low first round pick this year, and maybe something else. And if they do that, who's the right team? And I'll tell you, I in the back rooms, I kind of gave you grief because you went on a nice long discussion about the Panthers, and I said, man, you're stealing my thunder. That's my team. That's the team I had picked, is the Panthers, because they're a mid-level pick. It's right around 16. They have a connection with the Steelers. You've got an owner there who is a former partial Steelers owner. You got a real quarterback in Cam, but this owner just came out with an interview this week stating that he wouldn't be that surprised or upset if Cam Newton had to sit out next year if his shoulder's not healthy. If that's the case, I don't think the Panthers are any longer in the mix because they could have bigger worries. If Cam is healthy and they think he's 100%, maybe that's a trade partner that you can have. But I don't know that they think that yet. And I don't know that they're going to think that in enough time to make this work, because I still believe that for the Steelers to pull this off, it has to happen before they have to pay him that roster bonus. It doesn't mean that something can't happen after that, but man, it's tough because you're out another $2.5 million if you don't do it before that roster bonus gets paid. And so I still think that's maybe not a completely hard setting the ground line, but it's pretty close to, I think, where it's been. Now, I've also done a lot of reading, and I found out one of the things we touched on before was whether they could make a deal. And I had forgotten completely about the Kirk Cousins conversations and how they'd already worked out deals for stuff in January. They just couldn't announce them officially or put them to bed until the league year started. So there is absolutely nothing preventing the Steelers from talking to other owners and putting something in place or getting something ready to be in place. So I'm taking the Panthers back off of my list because of that. We talked about the Raiders and whether they would be willing to expend the draft capital, and I still think there's an outside chance that they may be a partner that works. and here's my new thinking on this. They've got 3 first-round picks, and I know Mayock is going to want to use those first-round picks. But if you can scratch out one of them, because I still think AB is a John Gruden type of guy, right? Gruden loves him. I think that Gruden would love to have him. The Raiders have 2 first-round picks next year because they've got the Bears and their own. If you could get the Raiders to give you, say, whatever the last one's going to be, 27 maybe, and a first and their lowest first rounder next year, I'd do that in a heartbeat.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think the Raiders of because I was looking at the Vegas odds because they make odds for literally everything in the sports world, and I was looking at the teams that I think were logical. And as much as I want to say that Mike Mayock's going to want to play with all 3 of those picks. Having 5 first-round picks in 2 years gives you an awful lot of ammunition to go and make a move for this. I know, again, they got rid of Amari Cooper. I think that was because they wanted to get rid of him, mainly for the fact that they weren't going to want to pay him money when he wasn't consistently producing for them. And you can make 50 different arguments as to why that was. And I think it realistically worked out for both sides. Amari Cooper's getting a career resurgence in Dallas, and they get a first-round pick out of it. I don't think that'll stop them from at least inquiring about Antonio Brown because he's a veteran, experienced receiver who give Derek Carr a nice, fun target to throw to. Having him be out in the AFC West would be nice because there's not as high of a likelihood the Steelers would consistently be seeing them because I don't think they're going to all of a sudden turn around into a elite team here overnight just because they have these first-round draft picks. But I think, he's a Gruden-type player. Gruden likes these veteran-type players, and if you have the ammunition to go for a guy like him, you can. And I think that makes sense, and it kind of comes back to the whole trading future picks. When you have 2 first-rounders next year, there's a potential that they could trade one of their late first-round picks this year and maybe one of their future ones next year that's not their own draft slot as a potential offset, due to the Khalil Mack trade. So I think realistically, it still makes sense because it's not like you're taking all this stuff away from Mike Mayock. And if it wasn't for Mike Mayock and Reggie McKenzie was still there, I would put the Raiders down. I'd be putting money down myself for the Raiders being the trade destination. I'm hesitant to say that they're the one because Mike Mayock, for those of you that don't follow the draft that much, is the guy that I've looked up to for years when it comes to me idolizing my draft abilities off of him. So if he is anything like he has been, he's going to want to play with those picks. But the Raiders have also shown an affinity for wanting to move around in the draft. And I think if they can do something to snag a guy like Antonio Brown, they certainly would look at that opportunity and run with it. And I think it'd be beneficial for both sides. It gives them a veteran target as they try to compete in the ever-competitive AFC West with teams like the Chargers and the Chiefs. And it gives the Steelers some extra ammunition to either maybe even move up and down the draft board if Colbert wants to and kind of make a 2003 type splash where they go up and snag a guy like Troy Polamalu. You never know.
Absolutely. I think, look, if you've got two first-round picks in the 20s this year, that, I think, gives you the capital to move around. That gives you the capital to move up if you want to. If the guy falls within what you think is the reach of that and you think you can go up and grab him, at least you've got some play and you're not strapping yourself. You're not giving away first rounders in the future, which the Steelers are very want to do. They won't do that. They don't mortgage their future for today. Plus, you've set yourself up with 2 first rounders next year. It's ideal. Now, one of the other potential things that has been bantered about is trading for a player. And the Cardinals come up big in this, in the sense of Patrick Peterson, because of all the drama that was surrounding Patrick Peterson as wanting out, wanting to go, wasn't going to come, wanted to be traded. And then he came back and said, "No, I never said any of that stuff. It's all baloney." Now, who knows whether any of that's true, not true. But I certainly wouldn't rule out a conversation being had that says, you give us your first, second round pick and Patrick Peterson, and we'll give you Antonio Brown. Is that enough value for this to work? Is that going to be enough to make this a value trade for the Steelers?
I think it would. I mean, you look at the contract situation for Patrick Peterson. I mean, he's still under contract for 2019 and 2020 with relatively for a cornerback of his status, you're looking at a cap hit of $11 million in 2019 and $13 million in 2020, and that's obviously without the roster bonus that the Steelers have to pick up, which is actually relatively minimal for him. But I see an opportunity there for them to be able to have a guy like Patrick Peterson step in next to Joe Hayden. That's a massive need for them, is to find somebody that can play consistent football on the opposite side there, and potentially draft another young cornerback to move in and not have to pressure them right away in the playing time. I think that'd be a beneficial move, especially considering the fact that Larry Fitzgerald, stated that he liked Kingsbury and he thought he could be a potential, a good coach for them, but he's not even sure if he wants to come back. And if he does, he doesn't know if he wants to be in Arizona. And with a young guy like Josh Rosen, who's a fiery, outspoken personality sometimes, and you have a young guy there like Christian Kirk, I think slipping AB into that offense with a guy who, is a young head coach, doesn't have any type of alliances, which, as we know, was a big deal apparently for Brown, looking with the relationship between Ben and Mike Tomlin. Having a young guy in there, having pieces around that offense like David Johnson, potentially assuming he resigns, Christian Kirk and Josh Rosen, I think that'd be appealing location for AB. On top of the fact that it gives them a veteran presence if Larry Fitzgerald were to decide to walk or retire now that his contract's up, it would kind of give you another playing option. So that way your offense isn't just floundering in the water with really nobody there to help you out. Fans that think they could snag the number 1 overall pick in any capacity are completely out of their mind. A team like the Cardinals, who doesn't pick this low that often, are going to relish in the opportunity to pretty much have the board be open for business for themselves. But I think getting their pick in the second round would present decent value for both of them. They need players, but I think the Cardinals are a lot closer. Even though the NFC West is one of the more difficult divisions, I think they're closer to having success than they are away from being, the number 1 overall pick again. I think Josh Rosen's development will be huge, and having, a coach that's not Steve Wilkes-Bee there will be huge. So I'm excited to see what they could do, especially if they were to add somebody like Antonio Brown to that mix. I think for them, especially if they are serious about moving on from Patrick Peterson, which I don't know how much I trust those reports. I think that was more media moving that situation around. I think it'd be a decent trade for both of them.
Yeah. Now on the flip side of this, a team that many people are bantering about it, and because they have the most cap space of anybody else in the league, is a team that I think you can probably rule out. And that's the Indianapolis Colts. And if you haven't read this, a guy named Greg Doyel of the Indianapolis Star wrote a really interesting article talking about how the Colts GM, basically, without mentioning names, meaning Le'Veon Bell or Antonio Brown, basically said, those guys are never playing here, ever. Those kinds of players, we don't want them here. Because we don't need that kind of distraction and drama in our culture. Talking about the guys that they have had there, guys like Edgerrin James and Reggie Wayne and Peyton Manning and those kind of things. It's an interesting article, and I kind of think after reading it, I'm sold on the fact that if the Steelers called, and I'm not sure the Steelers are calling anybody. I think the Steelers may be waiting for calls. But if the Steelers were to call Indianapolis, I feel like they might just hang up.
Yeah. I think from the Steelers end too, beneficial for them not to trade it to a team like the Colts, who I think are one more very solid draft class away from becoming a pretty consistent force in the AFC. I think handing them a guy like Antonio Brown when they already have an all-pro receiver like T.Y. Hilton would pretty much just be shooting yourself in the foot and trying to blame somebody else. And I think the Colts draft stock isn't that great. They do have 2 second-round picks this year after the Jets traded up for Sam Darnold. I think it'd be beneficial for them to move around. But with how well Chris Ballard has helped change his team around, and Frank Reich's the kind of the no-nonsense guy, whether you think you control AB or not, you can't. You're just inviting yourself to have issues if you're trying to set that precedent and then turn around and go after a guy like Antonio Brown, regardless of his talent. Because they prided themselves on having those no-nonsense, kind of unknown guys from at different positions that brought their lunch pail to work every day and got after it, and giving up draft capital that Chris Ballard seems to be pretty happy with having to work with. I'd be amazed if they went and did something like go after trading for Antonio Brown or even signing Le'Veon Bell, especially with how well Marlon Mack and guys like that played this year. So I once upon a time thought the Colts could be a good location. I don't believe that they're even in consideration unless they came with an offer to completely blow the Steelers away. But I don't envision that being the case.
Yeah. The other team that's getting a lot of notoriety and apparently is the favored team for Ronald Ocean is the San Francisco 49ers. There was, as we mentioned at the top of this, Antonio Brown and Jerry Rice have came out and Jerry Rice has said Antonio Brown really wants to play for San Francisco. That doesn't mean anything. Just whether he wants it or not doesn't mean much of anything. I cannot envision the Niners giving up their first round pick this year for Antonio Brown. I can see a deal conceivably for a second round pick in a next year's first, but again, you gotta have a bit of suspicion that that's still going to be a pretty high pick, and whether they want to sacrifice next year's future, the future of their draft capital for Antonio Brown is questionable in my mind. I've been very impressed with the way John Lynch has handled business there. And I guess my feeling is that's not a move he'd be interested in making. But who knows? They desperately need, I think, targets out there for Garoppolo when he comes back. They don't have a huge, strong receiving core in my view. So does it make them better? Absolutely. Does it make them a contender? I don't know about that. I still don't know that they're going to, contend with teams like the Rams, and I think the Seahawks are getting better, so I don't think that they'll still beat Arizona. But that's another team that everybody's talking about, and I don't know. My gut is that's while there's possibility there, it's on the low end of the spectrum.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. I like what John Lynch has done with them, trying to make these moves to make them work. The people I think the 49ers are going to give up the second overall pick when they're virtually being handed a guy like Nick Bosa or one of those elite edge rushers or defensive linemen. I mean, they're not going to pass up on an opportunity. And, looking at their 2019 draft class, they don't really have the draft capital, as far as I'm concerned, to be making a lot of huge moves and giving up a lot of picks to get a guy like Antonio Brown when they do have a lot of other needs. I'm not saying they wouldn't, but what we've seen from John Lynch so far at this time as GM is they want to accumulate picks or trade late round picks for guys that are kind of being overlooked by other teams that the other team's just trying to dump. They've traded some 5th round picks, they've traded some 7th round picks, and they've traded back. But under John Lynch so far, they haven't really shown the desire to give up some prime draft real estate for anybody, let alone a guy like Antonio Brown. I think a lot of the stuff with why we're looking at the 49ers as being a logical choice is because of what you said. Jerry Rice claiming that, AB is claiming that he wants to play in San Francisco so desperately, and all the things involving George Kittle tweeting at him and whatever. I think a lot of that stuff's show. I think they could definitely use a target like him. I think putting a receiver like Antonio Brown in that offense alongside George Kittle, Marquise Goodwin, and players of that nature, I think that'd be exciting for them, and it'd certainly help Jimmy Garoppolo with his development as he comes back from his ACL injury. I just don't think that John Lynch, when they have holes around their roster and they're not really an Antonio Brown away from having that kind of kick that they need to start competing with the Seahawks and the Rams, I don't see where it makes sense. I just don't envision John Lynch being willing to give up, some prime real estate when he doesn't have a whole lot to work with.
And they don't have a player. It's not like there's a player there where we can easily say, yeah, that's a guy that, that guy packaged with a second round pick, A, they're going to be willing to give up, and B, is a guy that we want.
Yeah, I mean, I've looked at their roster length, and there's really no guys there that I think, one, they'd be, like you said, they'd be willing to give up, or B, that the Steelers would be wanting to take that are going to drastically, say that that's the guy that this team needs to, take the next step and go to the Super Bowl. And for that reason, as much as they've been getting all the hype, I don't view the 49ers as being a legitimate contender. And maybe we'll be wrong. Maybe John Lynch will pull the trigger and, make a blockbuster trade and package some future picks, but they're missing some picks in the next couple years drafts. I just don't envision it being a move that they'd be willing to make.
Yeah, and so, other than the teams we've talked about, is there a team that you're looking at and saying this might work, and why?
I mean, personally, if I'm the Steelers, I'm looking to move Antonio Brown to a place where you're not going to have the opportunity to play him in the next 2 seasons, largely due to the fact that you never want to trade a guy away, regardless of how toxic they may or may not be to your locker room. You don't want to trade them to a place where they're going to have the opportunity to come in very early in the season and completely dominate you and say, well, I told you so. You lost the greatest ever. That's why, in my mind, I think the NFC South, whether it be a team like the Panthers, even with the Cam Newton or without the Cam Newton shoulder situation, I mean, to me, the Panthers, even with that potential for him to sit out next year if his shoulder really is that bad, Antonio Brown has a very good relationship with Cam Newton, something that has been called into question with his relationship with Ben Roethlisberger. You look at the owner for the Panthers being a former minority owner of the Steelers. There's the connection there. You look at the opportunity, the fact that they don't really have a true number one receiver. I think DJ Moore can be that guy down the road. I just don't think he's there yet. So giving a guy like Antonio Brown the opportunity to come in and perform, I think would be beneficial to them. You have playmakers like Greg Olsen, even though he's aging, with his backup Ian Thomas, who are both very good playmakers. Christian McCaffrey, I think, was this year's biggest Pro Bowl snub. What he was able to do with that offense was absolutely incredible. It's a very appealing offense for Antonio Brown to go to. I think he'd be happy there with it due to the relationships he has down there. And the fact, like I said, the Steelers will not play the NFC South again until his contract's up, which would, unless the Steelers were to meet the Panthers in the Super Bowl, you wouldn't have to worry about playing him, which would be huge. You can get rid of him and get the compensation back, which I think would be reasonable compensation, and never have to worry about coming in, having him show you up and prove to you why you did wrong by him. I would also say the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, but based on some comments by Bruce Arians calling the AB a diva, I don't think he's extremely that eager to pull the trigger and give him make a move for him, especially when he kind of wants to make his stamp on that offense and that team in general. But for me, they're not getting talked about. I just think the Panthers make a ton of sense to go with it. But if I had to gamble, I think the Raiders still make the most sense when it comes to the realistic options that have been in the circulating talking realm, just due to the fact that the capital's there, the need is there, and it would be beneficial for both teams.
Yeah, the thing that's really sold me against the Panthers is the fact that they don't have a lot of cap space, and if Newton can't play next year, then they got to get a quarterback, and if they got to get a quarterback, I don't know how they fit Antonio Brown in and a quarterback with the cap space that they have. It doesn't mean they can't, because you can always restructure guys. You can find ways to make it work, and every team has a cap guru that'll figure out a way to make it happen. But that starts to stress you going forward when you do things like that, as we've seen in the past with the Steelers, with things like the Lamar Woodley deal, where you put yourself in a bind when you're trying to make it work for down the road. So I just don't know, man. I mean, I agree with you wholeheartedly in every of the positive reasons that you said, and that's why they were initially one of my number one places that might work. Now I just don't know, because I don't think I really, we don't follow the Panthers except for Chase. And, I just didn't pay attention to how much, Newton may have or may not have a shoulder injury and how potentially serious that may or may be. Another team, though, that I find interesting, and it violates one of those rules because we would play him next year. That's true of San Francisco as well as Arizona, by the way, but is the Seahawks. Because I think this is a guy that is a dynamic playmaking receiver, and while the Seahawks have guys like Doug Baldwin and who's the other guy? I can't remember his name.
Tyler Lockett.
Yeah, Tyler Lockett. They're not AB. You put AB in that offense and give Russell Wilson that kind of a guy to throw to, who can find ways to get open and do different things, or draw coverage away from the other two guys. All of a sudden, that's a much more dynamic offense. But I don't know what their cap space is like because I didn't look, and I'm too lazy to do it right now. But I think here is again the only thing that works is picks, because I don't think that you can legitimately say there's a player that you want desperately that it makes sense along with picks. So now you're talking, you really have to get some good compensation, and the Seahawks don't have a lot of draft capital either, in the sense that they're going to be drafting lower in every round. So a second rounder and a future first rounder, I don't find that nearly as attractive from them. But I think they're an option. But the bottom line is I still come back to, I said it the last time we talked about this, and I'm sticking to the guns, but for different reasons now. I like the two late second round or first round picks from the Raiders. And if you can sneak something else in past, Gruden and Mayock, great. But if you could get that from that team, man, I think you've done the best you can conceivably do in this situation. And while we might play him again, we won't be playing him that often. So, yeah. Look, I still think that team's a mess. I think that team's going to be a mess for several more years. I think they've got the capital, and with Mayock there, they've got a good chance of capitalizing on the draft capital to move forward. But I'm not sold on Gruden being able to coach in this era. I think he was a guy that could coach when he coached. I just don't know. The game's different now, and I don't know that he's adjusted to it. Maybe he will. So I look at the Raiders again, and I keep thinking that's what makes the most sense. But something else could happen. Look, I think we all can agree there's three places he cannot go. Yeah. Cannot go to the Patriots, cannot go to the Ravens, cannot go anywhere else in the AFC North. If you wanted to trade him to the Bengals, that would almost be torturous at this point, and I kind of wouldn't be against it. But not the Browns, because I see the Browns as rising up, and I don't want him there. But the Bengals, you could if you could get enough back, I could be sold on that. Even though you got to play him twice a year, it almost feels like it would be fun to watch him suffer.
Yeah, Cincinnati at this point.
Yeah, because I don't think much of the Bengals. But you can't trade him to the Ravens. You can't trade him to the Patriots. Those are just no's. But any place else, Green Bay they have 2 picks in the first round this year. They've got a little draft capital, but they're a lot like the Steelers in that they don't do those kind of moves very often. So I don't see that as really highly likely. It'll be interesting to see how it pans out. It'll be interesting to see what future cryptic tweets come out of AB's account and how things progress. I'll tell you one thing: it's keeping us lively with some talk. So I think that's going to wrap us up for this edition of the Steel City Underground podcast. If for those of you who have hung around this long, we appreciate it. If you liked it, hit the like button. We appreciate all the comments. And hit the subscribe button if you haven't subscribed, and get the bell on, as they say, to get notifications of when new podcasts go up. We got a lot of interesting stuff coming up. Joe's got some great ideas for some podcasts. We're going to do some mock draft podcasts with a bunch of our draft guys, and carry us all the way through the off season. So, Zach, thank you again for taking the time. It's always a pleasure to have you on here. And anything else you want to leave the folks with?
Buckle up. It's going to be a fun couple months here.
No doubt about it. All right, everybody, that's going to do it for us. My name is Brian. His name is Zach. And as always, be kind. It's chaos out there.
We would like to thank you for listening and remind our listeners to follow us on social media and our website, www.steelcityunderground.com.